Daniel Carter used to think the worst day of his life would be easy to recognize when it came. He thought it would arrive like a storm, sudden, violent, undeniable. Instead, it came quietly. It came in the form of a sentence spoken across a kitchen counter by the woman he had loved for 12 years. His wife wanted a divorce. After more than a decade together, Emily Carter walked away from their marriage and into the arms of another man. She told herself she was leaving behind a life that had grown dull, predictable, and emotionally empty. In her mind, she wasn't destroying anything. She was choosing something better. And for a while, it really did seem like she had. She moved into a luxury penthouse with Mark Dalton, a successful real estate developer with money, confidence, charm, and the kind of presence that made people pay attention the moment he entered a room. There were expensive dinners, rooftop views, weekend plans, and the glow of a life that looked far more exciting than the one she had left behind. From the outside, Emily's decision seemed reckless, but rewarding. Then, only a few months later, the illusion collapsed. The same woman who had walked out of her marriage with quiet certainty found herself standing outside that same penthouse building with 2 suitcases in her hands and nowhere to go. The man she had upended her life for had given her a simple instruction. You need to leave. No long explanation. No emotional conversation. No tenderness. Just a door closing on the fantasy she had chosen over the life she once had. What Emily still didn't fully understand in that moment was that being thrown out of Mark Dalton's apartment was not the end of her downfall. It was only the beginning of the truth catching up with her. A truth about love. A truth about betrayal. A truth about the cost of choices made in selfishness and fantasy. And the man she had left behind? Daniel Carter was about to learn the truth that would change everything he thought he knew about the end of his marriage. Chicago's skyline glowed softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Daniel's downtown office as the last of his employees filtered out for the evening. The city lights reflected faintly across the polished surface of his desk while he remained in his chair a few minutes longer, focused on the final report he had spent most of the day preparing. At 41, Daniel had earned the kind of professional respect most people spend their whole careers chasing. Clients trusted him because he was dependable. Colleagues respected him because he was disciplined, calm, and rarely rattled under pressure. He wasn't flashy, and he never tried to be. His reputation had been built the slow way, through consistency, intelligence, and reliability. It was the same way he had built his life. But lately, beneath the order and routine of his workdays, something unsettled had started following him home. It wasn't a crisis he could point to. It was just a feeling. A quiet heaviness. A sense that something in his life had shifted and he had somehow missed the exact moment it happened. Eventually he closed his laptop, stood, slipped into his coat, and made his way out into the cool Chicago evening. The drive home was mostly silent except for the soft hum of traffic and the occasional sweep of headlights across his windshield. Daniel had always liked that part of the day. It gave him a chance to exhale. Work receded into the background, and home became the place where the rest of his life began. For 12 years, home had meant Emily. Their house sat in one of Chicago's quieter residential neighborhoods, a modern place with wide windows, clean lines, and the kind of warm exterior lighting that made it feel welcoming at night. To anyone passing by, it looked like the home of a stable, successful couple. The sort of place people imagined held security, routine, and quiet happiness. Daniel pulled into the driveway and walked inside expecting nothing more than the usual end-of-day routine. But the moment he stepped through the front door, something felt off. The lights were on in the living room, but the house didn't feel warm. It felt still. Emily was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand, her expression unreadable. She didn't look up immediately when he came in. "Hey," Daniel said, dropping his keys onto the table by the entryway. Emily glanced at him briefly. "You're late." He loosened his tie a little. "Client meeting ran long." She nodded once and looked back at her phone. Daniel stood there for a second, longer than usual. The silence between them had changed over the past few months. It wasn't the easy silence of two people who knew each other well enough not to fill every quiet moment. It was something colder than that. More uncertain. The kind of silence that grows when distance has already moved in. He headed toward the kitchen. "Did you eat already?" he asked. Yeah. That, too, had become normal. He opened the refrigerator, took out a container of leftovers, and put together a small plate without much thought. Behind him, the only sound in the house was the soft tapping of Emily's fingers against her phone screen. From the outside, Daniel and Emily Carter still looked like a successful couple. Daniel's career had given them financial stability, and for years Emily had seemed proud of the life they'd built together. But recently, things had shifted in ways Daniel couldn't ignore, even if he didn't yet know how to name them. He noticed it in the little things. Conversations that used to stretch naturally through dinner now died after a few strained sentences. Emily seemed distracted almost all the time. Sometimes he would glance at her across the room and see her smiling at her phone, small, private smiles he realized he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. When he returned to the living room with his plate, Emily was already on her feet. "I'm going upstairs," she said. "So early?" "I'm tired." Daniel looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." She disappeared up the staircase without another word. He sat down alone at the dining table and stared at the food in front of him, appetite fading by the second. For months he had been telling himself the distance between them was temporary. Marriage changed. Life got busy. People got tired. Not every quiet season meant something was broken. That was what he kept telling himself. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a question had started forming, one he didn't want to ask too directly because he wasn't ready for whatever answer might come with it. What if this wasn't stress? What if something else had already entered their marriage? Later that night, Daniel went upstairs and stepped quietly into the bedroom. Emily was already in bed, turned away from him. For a moment, the soft glow of her phone lit the blankets, then disappeared as she locked the screen. "You coming to sleep?" she asked, not turning around. "Yeah." He got into bed beside her and stared at the ceiling in the dark. They were only inches apart, but the space between them felt wider than the room. Daniel had always trusted Emily. Deeply. Completely. Loyalty had never been something he questioned in their marriage. But lately, small details had started gathering in his mind like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. The distance in her voice. The secrecy with her phone. The strange emotional wall that seemed to rise higher every week. Eventually, he closed his eyes and told himself, again, that he was overthinking everything. Beside him, Emily waited until his breathing changed. Only when she was sure he was asleep did she open her eyes. Carefully, she reached for her phone on the nightstand and lowered the brightness until the screen cast only a dim glow across the bed. She checked Daniel once more, then unlocked it. A message thread opened. The contact name was just one letter. M. Her thumbs hovered over the screen for a second before she typed. "I'll call you tomorrow." The reply came quickly. "I'll be waiting." Emily stared at the words longer than she meant to. Then she locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand. Beside her, Daniel slept peacefully, unaware that the first real step toward the destruction of their marriage had already been taken. And by the time he finally understood what was happening, it would already be too late. While Daniel was still trying to hold together what remained of his marriage, Emily had already begun living part of another life. A hidden one. A dangerous one. And at the center of that secret life was Mark Dalton. Mark was the kind of man people noticed immediately. In Chicago's real estate world, he had built a reputation for being bold, successful, and impossible to ignore. He was always sharply dressed, always self-assured, always speaking as if the world naturally made room for him wherever he went. He had charm, but not the harmless kind. His charm felt practiced. Emily met him nearly a year earlier at a networking event hosted by one of Daniel's corporate clients. Daniel had only stayed for a short time before leaving early to prepare for an important presentation the following morning. Emily remained behind, circulating politely through a room full of half-familiar faces and forgettable conversations. That was when Mark approached her. At first, it was just easy small talk. He asked about her interests, what she liked to do, how she knew the hosts. Nothing unusual. But there was something in the way he spoke to her that made the interaction feel more personal than it should have. He looked directly at her when she answered. He listened in a way that made her feel like she was the only person in the room worth paying attention to. "You look like someone who's bored by all of this," he said with a faint smile, glancing around the room. Emily laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone equally bored." It was a simple line, but it worked. Over the course of the evening, Mark found excuses to return to her more than once. Every time he did, the conversation became easier. More focused. More personal. He complimented her in a way that didn't feel overly direct, but still made her feel noticed. And that mattered more than she wanted to admit. For a long time, Emily had felt herself fading inside her marriage, not because Daniel was cruel or neglectful in any obvious way, but because his love had become so steady, so practical, so routine that she no longer felt seen in it. He still loved her. She knew that. But somewhere over the years, spontaneity had disappeared. So had the little moments of admiration, the curiosity, the emotional energy that once made them feel close. Daniel's love was stable. Mark's attention was electric. Within weeks, their brief interaction turned into regular messages. At first, Emily told herself it was harmless. It was just conversation. Just someone interesting. A distraction during long afternoons. A pleasant voice at the end of a dull day. There was no danger in that, she thought. But the truth was that the conversations quickly became the part of her day she looked forward to most. Mark knew exactly how to make her feel desired without saying too much too soon. "You know," he told her one evening during a late phone call, "you deserve more than being taken for granted." Emily sat outside on the balcony of her home, staring out at the Chicago night as she listened. "Daniel doesn't understand me anymore," she said quietly. Once she said it aloud, the thought began to harden inside her. That was how it started. Not with a dramatic betrayal. Not with a sudden decision. But with emotional drift. With rationalization. With the quiet rewriting of a marriage inside one person's mind. Soon, Emily began meeting Mark in person. Lunches became dinner. Dinner became private time. And private time became something she would later no longer be able to pretend was innocent. Mark talked about big ideas, ambitious plans, and a life that felt larger than the one Emily was living. He spoke as if the world was full of possibility for people brave enough to stop settling. Around him, Emily felt younger. More alive. More chosen. Meanwhile, Daniel remained almost completely unaware of what was happening. He noticed the distance, yes. He felt the tension. But he still believed the problem between them was something ordinary: stress, emotional fatigue, the slow erosion that long marriages sometimes endure. He thought patience might save them. Emily was already moving in a different direction. As the months passed, the secrecy became easier. Messages were deleted. Calls were taken outside. Stories were adjusted just enough to prevent questions. At first, Emily still felt guilty sometimes, especially when Daniel did something kind without knowing what she was hiding. When he asked about her day. When he suggested making plans. When he looked at her with concern instead of suspicion. But Mark had a way of reframing everything. "You're not betraying anyone," he told her over dinner one night. "You're finally being honest with yourself." It was a dangerous kind of comfort, the kind that takes selfishness and dresses it up as courage. Emily began convincing herself that the marriage had been broken long before Mark entered the picture. If Daniel had truly seen her, she thought, none of this would have happened. That was the lie she leaned on. What she didn't know was that Mark had done this before. Women like Emily were not new to him. The compliments, the patience, the carefully timed emotional intimacy, none of it was accidental. He understood exactly how to identify dissatisfaction and then position himself as the answer to it. Emily believed she had met someone who understood her. Mark believed he had found someone willing to blow up her own life for him. One evening, while they were having dinner in Mark's apartment overlooking the river, the conversation shifted toward the thing that had been hovering between them for months. "You can't keep living like this forever," Mark said, swirling the wine in his glass. Emily looked up. "Like what?" "Between two lives." She didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair and watched her. "You deserve something real." Her chest tightened. There it was. The conversation she had imagined and feared in equal measure. "Mark." "I'm serious," he said, cutting gently across her hesitation. "Why stay in something that already ended emotionally?" Emily stared down at the table, her pulse suddenly louder in her ears. Divorce had lived quietly in the farthest corners of her mind for some time. But hearing the possibility spoken aloud made it feel immediate. Concrete. Possible in a way it hadn't before. "What are you saying?" she asked. Mark held her gaze. "I'm saying you should leave him." The words sat heavily between them. 12 years. A home. A shared history. A life that had once meant everything. For a moment, Emily thought about all of it. Then she thought about the silence in her marriage. The cold dinners. The emotional distance. The way she had begun to feel invisible in her own life. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. "I think," she said, barely above a whisper, "I'm ready." Mark didn't rush. He let the moment breathe. "Ready for what?" Emily inhaled slowly, knowing that once she said it, the thought would no longer belong only to her private imagination. "I'm ready to divorce Daniel." And with that sentence, the line between fantasy and consequence disappeared. The conversation happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, ordinary in every visible way. That was part of what made it unforgettable. Later, Daniel would remember the details with painful precision: the glow of the kitchen lights on the marble countertop, the sound of distant traffic outside, the tablet in front of him with half-finished emails on the screen. He had been moving through the end of the day the way he always did when Emily walked into the kitchen and stopped across from him. Something in her posture made him look up immediately. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't glancing at her phone. She wasn't moving around the room pretending to do something else while talking. She was still. Too still. Daniel set his tablet down. "What's wrong?" Emily folded her arms lightly, then unfolded them again. For a second she looked around the room as though memorizing it. "We need to talk." Those 4 words were enough to make the air feel heavier. Daniel sat back in his chair. "Okay." She drew in a breath. "I think we should get divorced." For one strange, suspended moment, the sentence didn't fully register. It was as if his mind heard the words but refused to let them become real. "Divorced?" he repeated. Emily nodded. Daniel stared at her, searching her face for something that would tell him this was anger, confusion, temporary frustration, anything but a decision already made. "Where is this coming from?" "I'm not happy anymore." The answer was so clean, so rehearsed, that it made everything worse. He looked at her in disbelief. "Then we talk about it. We work on it." "I already thought about this." "For how long?" Emily didn't answer. That silence told him more than her words had. Emily, he said carefully, is there someone else? For a split second, she hesitated. Then she shook her head. No. The lie was calm. Direct. Controlled. And Daniel, still wanting something he could understand, looked at her and tried to find truth in a face that had already learned how to hide it. I don't understand, he said quietly. We've been together for 12 years. Emily looked away toward the window. People change. That was all she gave him. But for Daniel, it felt like the floor had shifted beneath his feet. He had no affair to point to. No betrayal he could prove. No clear event to explain why his marriage was ending. Just a woman standing in his kitchen telling him that the life they built no longer made her happy. The weeks that followed were a blur of practical decisions moving with cruel efficiency. Lawyers. Paperwork. Appointments. Conversations stripped of emotion and reduced to logistics. Emily moved through the process with a kind of detached focus that Daniel found almost surreal. She discussed property, timing, signatures, legal arrangements, as though the relationship itself had already been over in her mind for a long time and the rest was merely cleanup. Daniel tried more than once to slow things down. Are you absolutely sure this is what you want? He asked during one tense conversation near the end. Yes, Emily said. The answer never changed. The distance between them widened daily, and the house they had once shared began to feel less like a home and more like a place where two separate lives were temporarily crossing paths before final separation. Then one day, Emily packed her things. Daniel stood in the living room while she carried the last box toward the front door. He watched her in silence, almost expecting, at the very last second, that something human and vulnerable might finally break through. A real apology. An explanation. Some visible sign that leaving a 12-year marriage meant more to her than this cold efficiency suggested. But all she said was, "Take care of yourself, Daniel." Then she walked out. The door shut softly. It was such a small sound for something that changed everything. After she left, Daniel remained standing in that same spot longer than he realized. He didn't explode. He didn't throw anything. He didn't call after her. Something in him simply gave way. What came next was not dramatic heartbreak. It was something quieter and, in many ways, harder. It was silence. Dinner alone at the kitchen table. The television on in the background while he stared at it without seeing. The bedroom feeling too large. The routine staying the same while the meaning inside them disappeared. Most nights, Daniel found himself circling the same question over and over until exhaustion finally dragged him to sleep. What had he done wrong? Without the truth about Mark Dalton, the divorce felt like a mystery he couldn't solve. There had to be a reason. A moment he missed. A failure he didn't see coming. But no matter how often he replayed the last year of his marriage, the answer never appeared clearly enough to hold. Eventually, the process reached its legal conclusion. The judge signed the papers. 12 years of marriage ended with a few signatures in a courthouse. When Daniel stepped outside that afternoon, the city looked exactly the same as it always had, cars moving, people talking, sidewalks full, life going on as though nothing had happened. But his entire world had changed. Then, a few days later, the first crack appeared in the version of the story he had been given. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost casually, that Emily had been seen moving into a luxury apartment near the Chicago River. The apartment belonged to a man named Mark Dalton. And in that moment, a betrayal Daniel had only half suspected began to take shape in full. On paper, Daniel and Emily's divorce ended quietly. The court finalized everything. Signatures were filed. Legal obligations were sorted out. To anyone looking from the outside, it might have seemed like one of those unfortunate but ordinary endings that happen every day in big cities, two people growing apart, deciding to separate, moving on. But for Emily, the divorce had never felt like an ending. It was supposed to be the beginning. Only 3 days after the paperwork was complete, she stood inside Mark Dalton's penthouse, looking out over the Chicago River through enormous glass windows. The apartment was sleek and expensive in a way that barely tried to hide itself. Marble floors. Minimalist furniture. Clean lines. Perfect lighting. Everything about the place signaled taste, money, and control. Mark crossed the living room carrying 2 glasses of wine and handed one to her with a relaxed smile. "Well," he said, "welcome to your new beginning." Emily took the glass and looked around again. Part of her still felt slightly unsteady, as if she had stepped into someone else's life instead of her own. The last few months had moved so quickly that she'd hardly had time to sit still and fully confront what she'd done. But Mark's certainty made doubt feel unnecessary. He had a way of turning hesitation into momentum. Within days, Emily was adapting to a completely different lifestyle. Mark moved easily through Chicago's wealthier circles, and he seemed to know exactly where every important event was happening. There were rooftop dinners, private parties, investment gatherings, charity functions, and elegant spaces filled with people discussing deals, properties, travel, and money as though that world belonged naturally to them. Emily felt herself being absorbed into it. For the first time in a long time, she felt visible. Mark liked introducing her. "This is Emily," he would say, resting a hand lightly at her back. "She's someone special." The words were simple, but Emily gave them more meaning than they may have deserved. She let them fill in the blanks. She let them become promises in her mind. For a while, the whole thing felt exhilarating. The stillness of her old life had been replaced with motion and brightness. There were late dinners in the city, spontaneous drives at night, expensive plans made on impulse, conversations about ambition and possibility and refusing to settle for an ordinary existence. Emily told herself she had done something brave. She had chosen happiness. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, small things in Mark's behavior began to disturb that image. He almost never spoke about the future in concrete terms. Whenever she tried to bring up long-term plans, he would smile, kiss her forehead, change the subject, or say something easy and vague like, "Let's not rush ahead." At first, she accepted that. After all, her divorce was still fresh. Maybe he was being cautious. Maybe he didn't want to pressure her. Then she noticed something else. Mark liked control. Even though she was living there, he never referred to the penthouse as theirs. "It was always my place." When guests came over, he said it casually. "Come by my place around 8. When discussing plans, it appeared again. "I'll head back to my place after the meeting." Even in smaller moments, the language never changed. One afternoon, he said, "If you're going to invite anyone over, just give me a heads up. I like to know what's happening in my space." The sentence was polite enough on the surface, but it stayed with her longer than it should have. Another time, while they were talking over dinner, Emily mentioned taking a trip together. "You said we'd have a fresh start," she reminded him. Mark smiled, but there was something dismissive in it. "Relax," he said. "Things take time." Again, harmless on the surface. Again, not quite harmless underneath. Then came the inconsistencies. Stories that didn't fully match. Late-night calls that took him out to the balcony. Business meetings that seemed to appear out of nowhere and ended much later than expected. None of it was enough to confront directly, not yet. But the effortless excitement Emily had once felt started giving way to quiet uncertainty. What she thought she was building and what Mark thought he was enjoying were no longer clearly the same thing. One evening, they attended a private dinner with some of Mark's business associates. The conversation was relaxed, full of laughter, expensive wine, and the kind of subtle arrogance that successful people often mistake for charm. At one point, someone joked, "So how long do you think this domestic phase is going to last this time?" The table laughed. Mark laughed too. Then he said, "Let's see how long Emily can tolerate me." Everyone laughed again. Emily smiled because not smiling would have drawn attention, but something in her chest tightened. The joke lingered on the drive home. Mark didn't seem bothered by it. He hummed along quietly to the music in the car, one hand on the wheel, perfectly at ease. Emily stared out at the city lights flashing past the window and said almost nothing. Later that night, she woke to the sound of his voice somewhere outside the bedroom. The room was dark. The clock read just before midnight. She sat up, listened, and heard him speaking softly in the living room. At first she couldn't make out the words. Then she stepped closer to the doorway. And then she heard enough. "Yeah," Mark said in a low, warm tone she immediately recognized. "Last night was great." Emily froze. A few seconds later, he said, "I'll see you again soon." In that instant, the first real crack in her fantasy became impossible to ignore. For several weeks after moving into Mark's penthouse, Emily did her best to believe she had made the right choice. It was easy to sell herself that version of the story in the beginning. The apartment was stunning. The skyline shimmered at night. Mark seemed confident, successful, and socially untouchable. He took her to places Daniel never would have. He introduced her to people who seemed powerful. He spoke constantly about future opportunities, expansion, new projects, and the kind of lifestyle that came with success. For a while, it all felt intoxicating. But the thrill of a new life fades quickly when reality starts showing its seams. The first warning signs were small enough to dismiss. Mark often left early without saying exactly where he was going. He returned late and offered vague explanations, meetings, investors, property issues, last-minute business dinners. Whenever Emily asked questions, he answered just enough to end the conversation, never enough to invite deeper curiosity. At first she told herself not to read into it. He was busy. He was ambitious. He operated at a level she wasn't used to. Complicated schedules came with complicated people. Still, unease had begun to take root. One afternoon, while Mark was in the shower getting ready for yet another meeting, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Emily looked over automatically. A preview flashed across the screen before going dark. "Had a great time last night. When can I see you again?" Emily stared at the black screen after the notification disappeared. Her first instinct was denial. It could mean anything, she told herself. A client. A networking dinner. A business associate. In Mark's world, social and professional lines blurred all the time. Then the phone buzzed again. Same contact. That was the moment suspicion stopped being abstract. Later that evening, after Mark left for what he described as another late meeting, Emily opened her laptop and began searching his name online. At first, everything matched the image he had built. Articles about his developments. Professional photos. Interviews. Event appearances. Public success. Curated confidence. Then she dug deeper. Old social posts surfaced, pictures of Mark at events with women Emily had never heard about. Different names. Different captions. Different stretches of time that hinted at relationships appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. One article about Chicago's real estate social scene described him as charmingly unpredictable in both business and personal life. The line bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Over the next several days, the details she had ignored started stacking up. The guarded phone. The private calls. The casual smile he gave certain messages. The evasiveness. The invisible boundary she could now feel between the part of his life she was allowed to see and the rest of it. Eventually, suspicion became stronger than hesitation. One evening, Mark left his phone on the coffee table and stepped out onto the balcony to take a call. A message came in. The screen lit up. Emily stared at it for several long seconds. Then, with cold hands and a pounding heart, she picked it up. The thread that opened made the room tilt. The woman texting him spoke with easy familiarity, the kind that doesn't exist between casual acquaintances. There were references to nights together. Plans. Intimate jokes. The tone was unmistakable. Emily scrolled. Then opened another thread. Another woman. Then another. And suddenly everything clicked into place with brutal clarity. The words Mark had once used on her. The compliments. The emotional intimacy. The promises that had felt unique. She was seeing versions of all of it repeated in conversation after conversation. Not exactly the same wording, perhaps, but the same pattern. The same performance. The same manipulation dressed up as connection. Emily sat there on the couch for nearly an hour, staring at the phone in disbelief, grief, and humiliation. She had blown up her marriage believing she was choosing something rare. But Mark Dalton was not rare. He was just practiced. When he finally came back inside, she was still sitting there, his phone resting face up on the table in front of her. He saw the tension instantly. "What's wrong?" he asked. Emily looked up, her voice tight. "Was I just another woman to you?" Mark frowned, though not with guilt. More with annoyance. "What are you talking about?" She nodded toward the phone. "The messages. The women. How many are there?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled as if this conversation were inconvenient, not devastating. "Emily," he said, "you're overthinking this." Her expression hardened in disbelief. "Overthinking?" He walked toward the kitchen. "You're acting like we made some formal agreement." She stood up. "You told me we were building a future." Mark turned and looked at her with a level of detachment that made her stomach drop. "You were the one who left your husband," he said. The sentence landed with a kind of cold finality she could almost physically feel. Not because it was loud. Not because it was cruel in tone. But because it was true, and because of how little it seemed to matter to him. Everything she had romanticized suddenly looked grotesque. She had risked everything for a man who now spoke as if her sacrifices had been her decision alone, disconnected from any responsibility on his part. She stared at him, trying to find even a trace of the version of him she thought she knew. There was nothing there. Then he said, almost casually, "Actually, there's something we should talk about." Emily's voice shook. "What?" Mark leaned against the counter, perfectly composed. "I think it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay." And just like that, the fantasy she had chosen over her marriage came to its real end. The words were calm. That was part of what made them so brutal. "I think it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay." Emily stared at Mark, waiting for his expression to shift, for some sign of irony, frustration, exaggeration, anything that would turn the sentence into something less final. Nothing changed. "You're joking," she said quietly. Mark walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and took a sip before answering. "No. I'm not." The apartment suddenly felt unfamiliar to her. Same marble floors. Same expensive furniture. Same glittering city beyond the windows. But none of it felt like a place she belonged anymore. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "You asked me to move in." "And you did." The cold simplicity of that answer stung more than shouting would have. Emily shook her head slowly, unable to process how quickly the relationship she had risked everything for was being reduced to something temporary and disposable. "So that's it?" she asked. "After everything?" Mark gave her a look that suggested he found the conversation more tedious than painful. "Emily, let's be realistic," he said. "This was never meant to be permanent." The sentence echoed in the room. She felt the full weight of the past year press down on her all at once. The secrecy. The lies. The divorce. The certainty with which she had dismantled her old life because she believed she was stepping into something deeper and more honest. "You told me we were building something together." Mark gave a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You chose to believe that." That was the moment something inside her gave way. Not dramatically. Not loudly. It was a quieter collapse than that. A realization. A humiliation. A final stripping away of all the illusions she had been using to protect herself from the truth. Mark had never loved her. Not the way she had convinced herself he did. He had wanted her while she was exciting, emotionally dependent, and willing to orient her entire life around him. But love? Commitment? Loyalty? Those things had never been part of the deal for him. And now that the fantasy had become inconvenient, he was done. "How long do I have?" she asked after a long silence. Mark checked his watch as if they were discussing a contractor's schedule. "A few days should be enough." That was it. No apology. No regret. No emotional weight. Just logistics. Then he walked into his office, closed the door, and left her standing alone in the middle of the room. Over the next few days, Emily packed her things slowly. Every object she touched seemed to carry a layer of meaning she couldn't ignore. The dresses she had worn to private dinners. The shoes she bought when she thought she was stepping into a better life. The makeup bag she kept on the marble bathroom counter. The books she never really unpacked because some part of her had still been waiting to feel at home there. She boxed and folded and zipped everything up in silence, surrounded by evidence of a life that had never truly belonged to her. Mark barely spoke to her. He moved through the apartment as if the situation had already ended. On the morning she finally left, he wasn't even there. Instead, he sent a message. "Leave the key with the concierge." That was all. Emily stood outside the building with 2 suitcases and a box, the wind off the river sharper than usual against her skin. She looked up once at the towering glass building she had once seen as the symbol of her new beginning. Now it looked like a monument to her own bad choices. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life. Without Mark's money, his apartment, his invitations, and the lifestyle that had briefly made her feel elevated, everything fell away quickly. She rented a small apartment across the city, plain, quiet, functional, nothing like the glamorous world she had convinced herself was now hers. And in that small apartment, silence became unavoidable. Not the silence of luxury. Not the curated stillness of an elegant penthouse. Real silence. The kind that leaves you alone with your decisions. At night, Emily found herself thinking about Daniel far more often than she expected. At first it was little things. Daniel cooking dinner while asking how her day went. Daniel remembering small details. Daniel offering weekend plans she had dismissed because she was too distracted by messages from Mark. Daniel showing up, over and over, in steady ways she had once labeled boring simply because they weren't dramatic. The memories began to hurt because they no longer felt ordinary. They felt precious. Daniel had not been thrilling. He had been dependable. He had not dazzled her. He had loved her. And she had traded that for performance, vanity, and excitement that evaporated the second it was no longer useful to the man providing it. Some nights she sat for hours on her couch, replaying the moment she asked him for a divorce. At the time, she believed she was choosing freedom. Now she understood she had confused freedom with selfishness and excitement with sincerity. As months passed, regret stopped being an occasional feeling and became a permanent weight. Eventually, one evening, Emily sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment with her phone in front of her. Daniel's contact information was still there. She hadn't spoken to him since the divorce. For several minutes, she did nothing but stare at his name, remembering his voice, his patience, the life she had once walked away from so confidently. Then a thought surfaced that she had been trying not to face. He deserved the truth. Maybe not because it would change anything. Maybe not because she deserved forgiveness, but because he had a right to know what had really happened. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the phone. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, Emily seriously considered reaching out. The months after the divorce were not kind to Daniel Carter. At first, every day felt strangely hollow. The house still contained all the familiar shapes of his old life, furniture, photographs, routines, rooms, but the meaning had drained out of it. The emptiness was not dramatic. It was repetitive, persistent, harder to escape because it attached itself to ordinary moments. He tried to keep functioning the way he always had. He went to work. He answered emails. He attended meetings, reviewed reports, maintained structure. But every evening, when he came home to a silent house, the emotional reality waiting for him was impossible to outrun. For a while, Daniel moved through life on autopilot. Friends noticed it quickly. He was present, but only technically. He smiled when required, spoke when necessary. But there was a distance in him that hadn't been there before. The divorce hadn't just ended his marriage. It had destabilized the version of reality he'd been living inside. One night, during dinner with an old colleague and friend named Robert Hayes, the conversation finally turned toward the subject Daniel had been avoiding more than anyone realized. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself," Robert said carefully. Daniel looked at him but said nothing. Robert continued, "Talking to someone might help." Daniel knew exactly what he meant. Therapy had never been something he imagined for himself. He had always believed difficult things were supposed to be managed through discipline, endurance, and private reflection. Solve the problem. Stay functional. Keep moving. But after weeks of broken sleep, constant overthinking, and a mind that seemed unable to stop circling the same unanswered questions, he agreed to try. The first session was uncomfortable. Sitting in a quiet office describing the collapse of his marriage to a stranger felt unnatural. Exposed. But the therapist listened without interruption while Daniel explained what he had been living with: confusion, grief, and the relentless need to understand what he had missed. "I keep wondering if I should have seen it sooner," he admitted during one session. "There had to be signs." The therapist nodded. "Sometimes there are signs. But sometimes people only recognize them clearly once the story is already over." That sentence stayed with him. Week by week, therapy helped Daniel separate things he had been tying together. His value as a husband was one thing. Emily's choices were another. For a long time, he had treated the end of the marriage like evidence of personal failure. Therapy helped him see that someone else's betrayal does not automatically mean you were insufficient. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it changed its shape. Outside of therapy, Daniel slowly began rebuilding the rest of his life too. He threw more energy into work, not as avoidance this time, but as purpose. He accepted bigger projects, took on assignments that required travel, reconnected with goals that had drifted into the background during the later years of his marriage. The change was gradual, but undeniable. Friends noticed he seemed lighter, more grounded, more like himself. One evening, as Daniel and Robert were leaving the office, Robert glanced over and said, "You seem different." Daniel gave him a faint smile. "Different how?" "Like you've stopped carrying something that was crushing you." Daniel thought about that for a second. Maybe he had. The pain hadn't vanished. Some wounds don't vanish. But it no longer dominated every room in his mind. He had stopped waking up each day defined entirely by what had happened to him. Instead, he had started asking a different question. Not "why did this happen?" but "what now?" What kind of life did he want to build from here? That shift changed everything. Months passed with no contact from Emily. At some point, Daniel assumed that chapter of his life had closed for good. He no longer spoke much about the divorce, and when he did, there was no bitterness in his voice, just distance, perspective, and finality. Then one evening, while finishing some work in his home office, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. And froze. Emily Carter. He stared at her name for several seconds, surprised by the way memory rose so quickly even after all that time. The message was short. "Daniel, can we talk?" He leaned back in his chair, reading it again. A year earlier, he might have responded immediately, hungry for answers, desperate for closure, ready to hear anything that might help the ending make sense. Now he felt something very different. Caution. Clarity. Distance. After a few minutes, he replied, "What do you want to talk about?" Her answer came almost instantly. "I made a mistake." Daniel read the message twice. Then he set the phone down. He wasn't the man she had left anymore. Time, grief, reflection, and effort had changed him. The version of Daniel who once spent sleepless nights asking what he had done wrong had been replaced by someone steadier. Someone who had rebuilt himself without her. Finally, he picked up the phone and called. Emily answered almost immediately. "Daniel?" "Yes." There was a pause. Then her voice softened. "I know I probably don't deserve to say this, but I made a mistake." He said nothing. "I thought I was choosing something better," she continued. But everything fell apart. Daniel turned in his chair and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline beyond the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. "Some mistakes change everything." There was no anger in the sentence. That, more than anything, unsettled Emily. It wasn't rage she heard. It was distance. She fell silent, suddenly unsure how to speak to the man she had once wounded so deeply and now barely seemed able to reach. Daniel stood there looking out at the city, feeling the full difference between the man he had been then and the man he was now. Emily had come back with regret. But regret, he knew, did not automatically reopen doors. And now he had to decide whether the past deserved another chance, or whether it belonged where it had finally been placed. Behind him. The cafe Daniel chose sat on a quieter street just outside the busier part of downtown Chicago. It wasn't trendy or loud. It was the kind of place people went when they actually wanted to talk, soft voices, warm light, the clink of coffee cups, enough privacy for difficult conversations. Daniel arrived a few minutes early and chose a table by the window. As he waited, he noticed something almost surprising. He felt calm. A year ago, meeting Emily again would have shaken him. It would have stirred confusion, hope, anger, all the unresolved emotion he had once carried like a second skin. But sitting there now, he felt none of that chaos. He felt clear. The door opened, and Emily stepped inside. He recognized her immediately, but she had changed. She looked thinner. Tired. Less certain of herself. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly had been replaced with something quieter, more fragile. When she saw him, she hesitated for only a second before walking over. "Hi," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Hi, Emily." She sat down across from him, folding her hands together on the table as if trying to hold herself steady. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was simply full. Finally, Emily inhaled. "Thank you for meeting me." Daniel gave a small nod. It felt better to do this in person. She looked down briefly, gathered herself, and then said, "I owe you the truth." Daniel didn't interrupt. So she told him. All of it. Mark Dalton. The emotional affair that began before the divorce. How far it went. How she convinced herself she was justified because she believed she had found something real. She spoke quietly, and more than once her voice trembled. At the time, I thought I was choosing happiness, she said. I thought I was being honest about what I wanted. But I didn't understand what I was really doing. Daniel sat still and listened. Then she told him about what happened after she left, the penthouse, the false promises, the cracks in Mark's behavior, the women, the lies, and finally the moment he told her to leave as if she had never mattered at all. I destroyed everything for someone who didn't even care about me, she said, tears gathering in her eyes though she tried to hold them back. The words hung between them. Daniel leaned back slightly and absorbed the story he had been missing all this time. For months after the divorce, he had lived with questions he couldn't answer. Now the answers were in front of him, ugly and complete. Emily looked at him again. I know telling you this doesn't fix anything, she said. I know I don't get to erase what I did. But you deserve to hear the truth from me. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, when I asked if there was someone else, you looked at me and said no. Emily lowered her eyes. I know. You didn't just leave me, he said. You erased the life we built together and made me question all of it. She nodded faintly, unable to defend herself. I thought I understood what I was giving up, she whispered. I didn't. Daniel studied her face. The regret was real. He could see that. The pain was real too. And for a fleeting moment, he felt a trace of the compassion he had once carried for her so naturally. But compassion and trust are not the same thing. He looked down at his coffee. You came here hoping for something. Emily hesitated, then admitted it. I hoped maybe we could talk about starting over. Daniel let the silence sit between them before answering. There had been a time, in the immediate aftermath of the divorce, when hearing those words might have shattered him. There had been a version of him who would have wanted her back simply because the pain of losing her was still louder than his self-respect. But that man was gone. The person sitting across from Emily now had spent a year rebuilding his life piece by piece. He had fought for his own peace. He had worked to understand his pain without letting it define him. He had rebuilt a life that no longer depended on the person who broke it. And because of that, he knew what his answer had to be. Some things can't be started over, he said quietly. Emily looked at him, and though disappointment flashed across her face, she also seemed to understand before he said anything more. I know I hurt you. Daniel nodded. You did. He looked out the window for a moment, watching people move along the sidewalk in the late afternoon light. Then he said, but I'm not angry anymore. Emily seemed caught off guard by that. Daniel turned back toward her. For a long time, I kept asking myself what I'd done wrong. I blamed myself for not seeing it. For not stopping it. For not being enough. He paused. But eventually I understood something. What happened wasn't about me not being enough. It was about the choices you made. Emily listened without speaking. And choices have consequences. There was nothing sharp in his tone. No cruelty. No revenge. Just truth. Daniel stood up from the table. Emily remained seated, hands still folded, eyes fixed on him. I'm glad you told me, he said. I needed the truth, and now I have it. She looked up, her voice barely audible. I really am sorry. Daniel gave a small, almost sad nod. I believe you. And he did. But belief was not reconciliation. Forgiveness, in the deepest sense, did not always mean reunion. Sometimes it meant letting go without reopening the wound. Take care of yourself, Emily. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Emily stayed where she was, watching through the cafe window as he stepped outside and disappeared into the movement of the city. Cars passed. People crossed the street. Life continued. And for Daniel Carter, that was exactly the point. The past no longer had a claim on the life he had rebuilt. Inside the cafe, Emily sat alone with the full weight of what she had finally come to understand. Some losses cannot be undone. Some regrets arrive too late. And some doors close not out of cruelty, but because wisdom finally knows better than pain. The life she had once thrown away was not waiting for her anymore. It was gone. And this time, for good. Stories like this stay with people because they force us to think about something uncomfortable but true: how quickly one decision can alter the course of an entire life. Trust can take years to build and only moments to destroy. Loyalty often seems ordinary until it's gone. And sometimes the people we leave behind are the very people we only learn to value after it's too late. Emily learned that too late. Daniel learned something too, something harder, but stronger. He learned that healing doesn't always look like getting back what you lost. Sometimes it looks like refusing to reopen what almost destroyed you. And that leaves a question people answer differently depending on who they are, what they've survived, and how they understand forgiveness. If you were in Daniel's place, if someone betrayed you, lied to you, shattered your trust, and then came back with regret and the full truth, would you give them a second chance? Or would you walk away and never look back?